Mutual Broadcasting System presents STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. With today's briefing, here is retired Marine Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Colonel Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT, and our Strategic Risk Assessment Talk today is going to discuss, an area I've been wanting to get back to. You may have seen that there's a unofficial release of the Memorandum of Understanding with Iran. I'm going to leave that aside right now. I think I'm going to wait till the next STRAT before I address the issues in there. However, I want to talk about what's happening with Ukraine, Russia, and there appears to be a resetting, maybe very subtle, maybe it's just appearances and a few minor things in direction of U.S. policy on what we're doing with Ukraine in concert with the Europeans. And some of this seems to have solidified at the G7 summit this week in France. So whether this is policy change 2.0 or 3.0, and there's a whole discussion of what the point O's would be in that, let's kind of get into it. And I want to get into some of the background on this because a lot of times we look at the headlines and we see the little blurbs of what's happening now, but a lot of it's to understand the context with which this is happening. This is not conclusive, but it appears certainly in the last couple of days, maybe last little period here, that President Trump, among perhaps some others in his administration, but definitely President Trump, and you certainly see it from a number of very well thought out, developed articles, writing, and some things in the non-print media out there, that Russia is not winning. Their narrative that they're winning isn't even being believed in Russia. I don't even think Putin believes it anymore, though they still keep putting that out. And Ukraine is clearly not losing. In fact, if anything, it's going quite the other way. And this is a big shift. And this is something this is a 2026 thing. Really, it's in the last few months of 2026, we're really starting to see this big shift in terms of what this is happening. And it's a huge, huge shift. It's a big change that's occurring. Now, there's a lot of reasons why this would be happening. One of the things is we all recall at the beginning of of President Trump's term, his last term, he had that famous Oval Office meeting with President Zelensky where it really turned into a shouting match between President Trump and Vice President Vance, making their views known to President Zelensky. And that was certainly, one could say, Ukraine policy. Maybe that's 2.0, a distinct shift from what had been happening under the Biden administration with our support of Ukraine. And the term of, that basically that Ukraine isn't holding any cards. They don't have any cards. Well, I have to tell you right now, if you're looking at the cards the U.S. has been holding with its policy stance, I don't think that's pretty much a bad hand. If we've been listening to the Russian narrative that they're winning, then we're missing ground truth. And the Europeans seem to be a lot closer to what's going on there than the U.S. is. And maybe this is a shift. Maybe there's been a sudden realization that we're on the wrong side, so to speak. I hate to say we're on the Russian side, but I will tell you that many observers felt that we were being far too generous to the Russians in this whole thing, and that we need to kind of reset our thinking on this. So I just kind of throw that out there, something to ponder. G7 leaders, generally speaking, we're pushing for maybe a new peace initiative with Ukraine. There's a lot of things that they look at Ukraine, and there's some concerns they tie to that war with China. China, of course, the biggest supporter of Russia. Also, some new reporting that China has been actually training Russian troops in drone tactics, along with supplying Russia with a variety of things. Maybe not fully completed weapon systems, but a lot of components that then the Russians turn into weapon systems. And that has been a rather difficult situation from a U.S. policy standpoint that China has been doing this for quite some time. The reason it's so important to say, well, okay, they're turning them in drone tactics. Look, 70% of the casualties on the battlefield in Russia, Ukraine are by drones. So this is not an insignificant thing when you say they're turning them with drone tactics. Again, Ukraine is not losing, and it's very clear that Russia is not winning. The momentum shift is apparent. It's absolutely unambiguous, and it changes everything. The Institute for the Study of War, which I probably look at every day, has confirmed across multiple consecutive weekly, some would say weekly into monthly, assessments that Russian forces are surrendering net Ukraine territory. In some cases, the Russian forces are just surrendering, but that basically Ukraine is picking up territory and they're picking up the pace. The deep strike campaign that Ukraine has had across Russia, hitting Moscow, hitting St. Petersburg, hitting places beyond Moscow, their oil facilities, manufacturing facilities, petrochemical plants, chemical facility, all sorts of things that they've been hitting. This is having a growing impact across the board. And it's being seen by the Russian people. It's being seen by these urban elites in these two major cities, these two major metropolitan areas. Russian forces, for example, registered a net loss of 69 square miles of Ukrainian territory. That's quite a bit of territory in the 4-week period ending in mid-May, May 19th. In a single week ending May 19th, Russia lost 29 square miles. That's a significant battlefield setback. In the previous week, Russia had lost 12 square miles, so it wasn't just an aberrant thing. In the 4-week period preceding that one, Russia with all the forces and all these losses of somewhere around 1,300 troops per day that they're losing, gained a total of 2 net square miles. In other words, whatever the reporting was on Russian offensive action and Russia was gaining ground, even though they were losing a lot of troops, that has shifted. They're losing ground. They're still losing the troops, but they're losing ground. Russian forces lost control of roughly 281 square kilometers over a very recent 6-month period. All right. And Russian forces lost 116 square kilometers in just April. So what that tells you is this thing's been going on for a while. Now, Zelensky said last Friday on June 12th that Russia has lost at least $7 billion since the start of the war as a direct result of attacks on its oil sector. And believe me, the Ukrainian attacks on its oil sector have been significant. They've been well thought out. The targeting has been well done, and it is having a big effect. You know, the ability to strike key infrastructure deep inside Russia has highlighted Russia as Ukraine's really its growing military capabilities across the board, and it's really put tremendous pressure on Russian air defenses. Air defense missiles are expensive. They're difficult to produce. Well, I should say they take a while to produce. They don't produce them in the same quantities. One of the things are if you're producing offensive missiles, you can usually produce those a lot cheaper and a lot faster than defensive missiles because of what defensive missiles have to do. And, you know, the reporting as of us literally looking at before this recordings, and it was talking about the fact that Russia just can't keep up on producing enough air defense missiles. It's also forced a lot of Russians to force the consequences of war and also to see the reality of the claims the Russian government's been making about that they are, quote, winning. You know, the key elites appear to be losing patience with what Putin's been saying, losing patience with the losses and the sacrifice that Russia's been being put in. In other words, they're frustrated. And the average Russian appears to be, you got to remember, this is a very autocratic system with huge penalties for criticism of Putin, but they appear to be more critical of what's happening in the war. Now, Ukraine's intermediate range strike campaign has undermined logistics needed on the front lines. And this is something the Institute for the Study of War has also talked about. Ukraine has routinely using these kind of mid-range drones to strike Russian logistics behind the front lines, usually somewhere between 15 to 200 kilometers from the front lines. And and it's really overwhelmed, and they've been hitting their air defense systems. It's overwhelmed their air defense systems in this area. They've been hitting air defense. They've been hitting command centers. They've been hitting communications dumps. They've been hitting supply chain logistics capabilities, been hitting a lot of trucks. This focus on destroying Russian supply trucks and disrupting the logistics is somewhat new. Now, in fairness, since the beginning of the war, the Ukrainians figured out that hitting trucks was a really good idea. And they were hitting them with a bunch of stuff, and they realized the Russians can't generate a lot of supply trucks that quickly, so hitting trucks. But this recent shift in really going after these trucks has done some really amazing things in terms of cutting off logistics at frontline units. Frontline units have a very tough time pushing the attack if, A, the troops on the front line are literally starving. They don't have enough ammunition. They don't have medical care. When they're shot or wounded, they can't get evacuated. There's just a lot going on there. So the ability of the Russians to initiate and maintain offensive operations is evaporating with this intermediate range campaign. Crimea, that peninsula that juts south into the Black Sea area that Russia they've held since 2014. They've claimed it's always been Russian territory. Anyway, Crimea has gone from being a logistics haven for the Russian offensive to being an area where the Russians don't want to put a logistics in there. In fact, they've just recently have pulled out their command center for their Black Sea fleet from Crimea because they realize that's just an untenable position. Everything there is easily under fire. And having any supply dumps there, having anything down there is a very hazardous situation. The famous land bridge that runs from down through Zaporizhia Oblast into Kherson Oblast into Crimea. There's a big highway. It's kind of a coast road thing that runs through there. The Russians just recently said, don't use that. Why? Because they're getting constantly hit with drones when they run convoys through there to the point where they can't really protect them. And they're losing so much, they said, look, find another way to get stuff to Crimea because this is just not the way to go. That may not seem like a big deal, but that land bridge is pretty much the big thing that Russia put in place at the end of, starting at the end of February 2022. They built this land bridge. Now, they did not overrun all of Ukraine like they thought they would. Big chunks of Ukraine they've had to pull out of or were pushed back. And so that they hold that territory, but they can't control that territory. And that's because of this intermediate range capability. Close to the front line, the Financial Times recently did some reporting where they talked about this kill zone area that extends about 15 kilometers behind the front line. And basically, it's a drone-dominated no man's land is the best way to discuss it, going back to the no man's land concept from World War I. It's a strip of land closest to the front lines where anything that moves on wheels, on foot, on treads, whatever, gets targeted and destroyed by first-person view FPV drones. The sound of rotors is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's always overhead. It never stops. And little thin fiber optic cables that are basically part of this unjammable drone concept where it's hardwired in. So when you use electronic warfare to block the signal with the drone or hijack the drone signal or whatever, you can't do it if it's hardwired in. They now just cover the battlefield. They crisscross everywhere. And if you look at pickup trucks that are close to the front, they're encased in these big shield spiked cages that are meant to intercept drones. It's an area that, generally speaking, runs out about 15 kilometers from the front lines. Although there's a couple of places where they've tried to push that out to 50. That's 50 kilometers from the front lines. That's really big. And there's reports of soldiers crawling under with anti-thermal cloaks or blankets over them, literally crawling for days to the battlefield, try to avoid being seen. Supplies are arriving by drone because they can't get them up to the lines any other way. And the wounded, and this is something the Ukrainians have really innovated on, the wounded are being evacuated by robot because of the danger of using people to evacuate wounded. So they put them on these very low-to-the-ground robots, and the robots take them out and get them out of there. Really interesting to see. And the only time that they can do any significant land movement or vehicle movement is when there's bad weather, which means that's the time the drones can't fly. So it's really changed the battlefield in some major ways. There's recent reports that a lot of these influential voices, these oligarchs or elites in Russia within the political establishment are really questioning the trajectory of the Ukrainian war. Their criticism isn't necessarily anti-war. The Russian population has, frustratingly, but mostly been at least passively accepting of the war. But this shift represents what I would call a growing concern in the Russian body politic that there is no obvious path to victory. It's not that the Russian army has been defeated on the battlefield. It's just that there's really no way they see that they're going to get there. And that some of the promises have really only seemed to erode the economy and the political capital of the Russian state. A recent Time magazine article is talking about the political business elites are really just tired of the war. They want to stop. And they doubt that Putin has the capacity to stop the fighting. He's really kind of stuck in that regard. And they're recognizing his stuck. And his being stuck means that they don't see a path to ending the war with Putin still in office. Obviously something that Putin has to, address himself. Now, they talked to 7 people very familiar with the situation, and all of them asked not to be identified, obviously, because this issue is so sensitive. But there is a growing despondency within Russia amongst the elites, amongst the political influencers, if you want to use that term, that this is falling apart. And there's now kind of a blame game going where they're trying to pin responsibility for this faltering or failed invasion. And this is causing public division between some of the nationalist hardliners and certainly those who are in the Russian Defense Ministry. And the Kremlin's facing a Ukrainian counteroffensive that is now backed up in billions of dollars in weapons that have come from Europe and the U.S., especially when you look at this recent 90 billion euro European Union loan that was just approved by the EU when Orban was voted out of office in Hungary. That was the thing that was stopping this thing from being approved. He's gone. It's approved. That money is already flowing into Ukraine. Not all of it's going to weapons. Not all of it's going to military, but a lot of it's going that way. And this really puts a huge cushion, if you will, financially speaking, for Ukraine to rely upon in going forward and prosecuting the war and also keeping its economy and its country going while it's doing so. And really, again, the only significant advances on the battlefield have been Ukrainian. The winter, if there was a winter offensive, it didn't do much. The spring offensive's gone to a completely different direction. It's going against the Russians right now. And so they're looking at accepting these massive daily casualties from this war, and they're not going anywhere. So anyway, the G7's going this week. President Macron kind of leveraged his relationship with President Trump, and he basically was very aggressive and kind of maneuvering the entire G7 summit this week to put the war in Ukraine back on President Trump's radar. Obviously, like everyone, there's been so much focus on the Middle East and Iran. That's kind of what President Trump's been focused on. So he somehow worked a way to Trump, when he was going in there, was not going to meet with President Zelensky, even though President Zelensky is going to be at the G7 summit. All of a sudden, there was a big meeting with President Trump, President Zelensky, and all reports are it was a very positive meeting. It accomplished quite a bit, and so that just having that meeting was a big deal in and of itself. By the end of the day where that meeting took place, President Trump said that he would end the temporary sanctions waivers on Russian oil. That was something we had waivers on Russian oil going back to when Russia went into Ukraine and when the Strait of Hormuz got closed in order to keep more oil in the international marketplace, President Trump, the White House, temporarily dropped those waivers. There were certainly more than a few questions out there, which is he ever going to reimpose those waivers? Because this was allowing billions of dollars in revenue to flow into the Kremlin's coffers that they could use to fight the war. It became a big revenue source for the Kremlin to continue its war effort. He ended it. I thought that was actually probably, it's not, I know it doesn't sound as sexy as some of the other stuff that gets reported or as big or as important. I thought that was actually one of the biggest things that came out of this was that shift on just the waivers on Russian oil, on sanctions, on waiver sanctions on oil. He also agreed to issue military production licenses to allow U.S. companies to produce long-range missiles with Ukraine, and signed off on a G7 statement. It was a declarative statement at the end talking about unwavering support for Kyiv, basically unwavering support for Ukraine. He signed off on that. He agreed to it. All right. May not sound like a big deal, but considering some of the rhetoric that's come out of the White House over the last year, I thought that was a very good deal. So is this a full reset of the White House position on Ukraine? I think it might be a little early to tell, but it does seem to signify that it's moving in a very different direction. All right. Some of this is a result of diplomatic maneuvering at the G7 and outside the G7, but I think a lot of this is tied to what we just talked about, the aforementioned facts on the ground, so to speak, of what's happening in Ukraine and Russia. All right. Look, our recent conflict with Iran probably did not go the way, I'm going to say it, I don't think it went the way the White House had hoped it would. And based on the result, what's ever being reported now about what the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, is going to look like, or what's been released so far, it kind of appears a lot of concessions by the U.S., not so much for Tehran. And for many out there, to include GOP members of Congress, they might be a little confused as to why we did this war, looking at what the outcome of the war is going to be. And they're getting a little bit more vocal about that. And they're being right now this week, I'm hearing phrases like, we're holding off judgment until we see the full MOU, which has not been released. But that's a nice way of saying, what they have seen is something that they probably aren't exactly thrilled with. So they're waiting to see the full document. And that's, maybe whatever shows up at the end of the week will not be what's being kind of leaked or released now. Maybe it'll be significantly different, but that's kind of where things are. So that's another way of saying the war with Iran has definitely not put political wind in the sails of President Trump or the U.S. going into the G7. The only thing that was really positive about that was the fact that we had basically signed off on some sort of MOU that was ending the war. But as far as the outcome of the war, that's a little problematic right now. So there was little doubt that the White House is going to try and spin this thing as much as they can. But also keep in mind that Iran is going to spin this thing, and that Russia and China are in the background, maybe adding a little bit to the spin. But the thing is this, look, the Gulf states, there's a thing in there right now where they're talking about the Gulf states are going to put up a fund for $300 billion to for reconstruction in Iran. I got to tell you, the Gulf states who have been victims of Iranian aggression in this war, they've got to be looking at this thing, wondering what's going on. It talks about stopping the fighting in Lebanon, and if you're the government of Lebanon or Israel and you're dealing with Hezbollah, having the U.S. and Iran making a decision on what goes on in Lebanon and what goes on that threatens Israel, that's got to be certainly more than a little bit disconcerting. China's got to be looking at the everything that just transpired with the war in Iran and wondering if looking at, okay, so this is how the U.S. fights war, and they'll be looking at this and wondering, could put some doubt into maybe they've always thought, that a number of countries do, that the U.S. is a paper tiger, that we don't have the willingness to stick things out, that we're not willing to make the sacrifices in order to prevail. And I don't think what's coming out of this MOU process is really changing that narrative much. It really kind of reinforces this view that the U.S. doesn't want to make the big military sacrifices in order to prevail in these types of wars. And certainly if you look at our rather chaotic exit from Afghanistan, that did not look good for us. So I think there's a lot of reasons why President Trump might want to look at Ukraine and do a reset. If the U.S. is generally shifting its position to really get behind Ukraine, to enable Ukraine perhaps to decisively defeat Russian forces on the battlefield, which has now become something that we were talking about in 2023. Then we kind of quit talking about it. Now we're looking at going, it looks like maybe not all at once, but the chances of a Ukrainian breakthrough looks more and more likely as we're moving forward. I'm not holding my breath, but it's something, and that would be certainly a strategic victory for the U.S. and Europe being on the right side of how that war ends. And I will say this, President Trump, if there's something true of him, Donald Trump, he always wants to be on the winning side. And so right now, a reset might make sense if he perceives that Russia can't win, and certainly that Ukraine's not losing, which leads to Ukraine is going to be winning. He might want to shift his position to make sure that it looks clear that the U.S. is on the winning side of that conflict. So I think this is something that bears close scrutiny. I'm watching it. I'll see if there's more concrete actions that follow this up. I'll see if what's being reported about the Iran MOU is true with what is signed, eventually signed in Switzerland. But right now, it looks like there's a lot of reasons why the White House may want to really move its policy into fully supporting Ukraine in a more concerted manner and maybe pull back on asking for Ukraine to make concessions to Russia and maybe even put pressure on Russia to make concessions to Ukraine. Thanks for listening to Strat. Also, please visit stratpodcast.com. You can also go to the Hal Kempfer TV channel on YouTube. You can always go to my website, GRIPSA, GRIPSA for Global Risk Intelligence and Planning.com, GRIPSA.com. And you can still pick up my Gray Zone webinar that I did with Los Angeles InfraGard. That's at www.infraguardlosangeles.org. That encore is still going on, and I think we're going to have an encore shortly for the Global Threat Update, A World of Wars webinar that I just did. As I'm recording this, just did yesterday, but I think we're going to be playing that for a while as well, and that's a little bit longer. That's 2.5 hours. So if you have some time and you want to hear once around the world on all conflicts and things going on like this, even some things here in the U.S., hope you can go and register and have a chance to give it a listen or a look, so to speak. And thanks again for listening to Strat, and hopefully you'll listen to our next one.